For my technology and civilization project, I became an expert on the pre-industrial surveying tool adapted by the Romans, the groma. The groma was used to measure out straight lines and angles from a designated point. This tool was a great advancement that assisted in building roads and mapping out cities in the 4th century BC. Here is a step-by-step tutorial of me constructing my own groma. Enjoy! I started by sawing off 1.5 inches from the bottom of my broomstick I'm using as the stand for the groma. I did this just to make sure the circumference of the drill bit I'm using wasn't bigger than the circumference of the stick to ensure stability. Here is a picture of the step drill bit I glued into the hole I drilled, which will keep the groma stuck in the ground. Next, I trimmed down the rotating arms. I cut the lower rotating arm 2 inches shorter than the top one because I planned on using small hooks to hold my weight and didn't want the two to collide when rotating them. I measured where I wanted to trim and made sure my saw was in line before cutting the wood. Next, I used a speed square to measure the middle of the rotating arms and drilled a hole for where I will hold the two arms together with simple fittings. A tip I learned for drilling more accurate holes is to apply tape on the bit to mark how deep of a hole you need. To know where to put the tape, I compared the screw link to the bit and marked it off. Next, I'm cutting out a simple wooden block that I will use to connect the rotating arms to the base rod. I sanded the rough edges down to make it look smoother. Since this block is a perfect square, I use the speed square again to draw an X down the face of the wood to find its center. In the center of the block, I used a paddle drill bit to make a big hole for the rod I made earlier to fit into. It is important to measure out the right size bit for the rod by using a caliper, otherwise it will not piece together properly. Once again, I used the T-edge of the speed square to make a perfect line down the middle of the rotating arms to begin making my telescoping slot, which I will go into detail about later in the video. I also added a few horizontal lines to know where I wanted to drill. I had a few difficulties trying to film the beginning of this step myself, but I went in and drilled 5 holes down the line in order to make filing easier in the next step. After attempting to file down the line of the holes, I realized it was going to be harder than I thought. I decided to drill more holes down the line to make it easier to file. Filing with a handheld circle file was the most difficult step in building my project. I ended up asking my dad to help me by using a router with a slot cutting bit so that the slot would be more even and aligned. Here's an overview of the parts I've made so far. I'm using a clamp to hold my base together because I applied wood glue to them. I used a smaller piece of scrap wood in order to cover the large hole I paddle drilled earlier for the rod base so the clamp would work properly. Next, I began drilling small lead holes 1/2 inch from the ends of each rotating arm. I did this in order to make hand screwing my hooks in easier and to ensure that they would be placed properly. Once again, it is very important to measure the perfect size drill bit for the size of the screw eyes with a caliper. I began by hand screwing in 2 of the screw eyes before I realized that I could use a flathead screwdriver to get them in easier. I also learned that the closer the eye was to the tip of the screwdriver, the more leverage it had. Here is an overview of the pieces and findings that will make up the top of the system. Now it is time for the best part, assembly! I put together all of my pieces and they all fit together perfectly as I had planned. I pieced the wooden X together by using a large screw eye, a washer, and an adjustment knob.
I bet it's Yankee Candle.
Here I am testing out to see if the telescoping slot worked, and it did. I came up with the idea to add a slot to my groma so that if the point I wanted to measure from was only a few inches away from the base rod, I could horizontally adjust my system to receive a more precise measurement. This is a more efficient method than having to ensure you are sticking the base rod into the ground at a perfect distance from the point of measurement. As you can see, I was very happy to watch all of my hard work come together exactly as I had planned out. The last step in creating my groma was to tie a 2-ounce fishing weight to 2 feet of fishing line 4 times and a 6-ounce fishing weight to 4 feet of line. I used 50-pound braided fishing line so that it would be thicker and easier to see when they are all in line with each other. In honor of the Iron Bowl this weekend, I decided to paint my groma auburn colors. Here's my groma officially ready for testing. Before I started, I put one stake in the ground directly below the weight hung from the center of the rotating arms to act as my point of control. When the Romans used this tool, they would have one person serve as a helper with a stick across the way to mark the measured point, and one person act as a surveyor with the groma. In my testing, I asked my dad to be my helper, and I was the surveyor. In the video, you can see I'm lining up my eye with the 2 opposing lines, and the line hung from the intersection at the center of the X. The angle of the video makes it a little difficult to see precisely. After aligning the 3 vertical lines to make one, I would tell my dad to move the tip of the stick either to the left or to the right until it was perfectly lined up and covered by the fishing lines. Next, I ran over and put a stake in the ground to mark my measurement at the tip of the stick and walked my groma over to the measured stake so that I could double check it with the designated point of control from the other side. You can tell by how all over the place this clip is, I was very excited to finally use the telescoping slot I added. I loosened the knob to adjust the cross system so that the middle weight hung directly over the measured stake. By creating a slot, I was able to make horizontal adjustments to help align the middle plumb line with the center of the stake without having to remove and replant the base rod into adjusting spots in the ground. This took a little bit of trial and error, but eventually I got it perfect. The day I tested my groma ended up being a very windy day. I remembered when I conducted my research that the Romans would dip the plumb bobs, in my case fishing weights, in water when they were in windy conditions. Since I was testing on a windy day, I decided to give it a try. I was not entirely sure if it helped much, but by theory it did. In this overview of the top of the system, you can see the slot I was adjusting. Next, my helper went back to the designated point of control while I repeated the same steps to line up the 3 weighted lines. Again, I instructed my dad to move the tip of the stick to the left and to the right until it was perfect. Finally, I tested my groma by measuring a 45-degree angle. My dad and I repeated the same measuring process as earlier. A little bit right. A little bit closer to you. Yeah. That looks about right. As you can see from this clip, the measurement looks accurate.